welcome music journalist Rob Tannenbaum.
I was in the wings, and the excitement when you guys saw Paul Rudd's name was palpable, followed immediately by the disappointment when you saw my name. Trust me, my wife is also disappointed that I'm not Paul Rudd. So I went to the show in New York, and they did get Paul Rudd. Cleveland, you get Paul Rudd's dad. Thank you, thank you. My relatives are here, as you can tell. Thank you, thank you. Is something interesting on your phone? Don't make me take that phone away from you, please, because I will. We already know the Browns won. You don't need to check the score. So why am I here? Tonight will be the third time that I've interviewed Geddy. The first time was in 2009 when I was working for a music magazine called Blender. Blender's goal was to put Rolling Stone out of business. We wanted to embrace all the bands that they had ignored. And so we decided that we would ask for an interview with Geddy Lee, and fully expecting that the answer would be no, because everybody knows Rush doesn't do interviews. Well, this was the beginning of their period when they started saying yes to things instead of saying no to things. And so Geddy said yes. I went to Toronto, went to his house. He was very gracious. He talked about wine. He didn't offer me any. So he wasn't that gracious, I guess. It reminded me of a time I interviewed Willie Nelson on his tour bus. Willie puffed, but he didn't pass. And probably I should be grateful because I don't think I could have survived smoking Willie Nelson's weed. So I did the interview with Geddy and came back to New York City where I live, and we ran the article in Blender magazine, and that was the last issue that Blender ever published. We tried to put Rolling Stone in the grave, and they put us in the grave instead. I don't blame Geddy necessarily. Could just be a coincidence. So that was the first interview. The second one was pretty recently, again in Toronto, for the publication of his book, My Effin' Life. And we went to a diner that Geddy and his mom used to frequent a lot. We had Rosedale Diner. Sorry to disappoint. I just keep disappointing you guys. We had a nice 2-hour lunch. There were, oh boy, we laughed a lot. We discovered that we had learned some of the same Yiddish insults. I don't know, anybody here familiar with Get Kaken off and Yam? What does it mean? Go shit in the ocean. If you want to insult somebody, Yiddish language just has this worked out for you already. So we had a nice long lunch, and I paid. Not that it doesn't matter. So part of it was very serious, and part of it was huge fun, and we're going to try and do that tonight also. Cleveland. I think you guys know this. I mean, some of the younger people may not know this, but Cleveland is a very important city in Rush's career. There were pockets or radio stations in the United States that embraced Rush's music when other stations didn't. And one of the biggest ones was WMMS. MMS was playing Rush, I'm talking about before the hits, right? And Rush always had great audiences here. So that's why they brought me here, I guess. They knew that you guys would be so kind to me, right? So we're gonna have some effing fun tonight, and it's time to start my effing interview with my favorite effing author, Geddy Lee. Good to be in Cleveland, right?
Always.
Can you remember? You have a not only do you have a really good memory, you also did a lot of research for your book. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the first place you ever played in Cleveland?
Yes, it was the Allen Theater, not very far from there, right? We were opening for ZZ Top, and that was with our first drummer, John Ritz.
John.
Yeah.
Is there anybody here who's going to claim they were at this show?
They're all way too young.
Everyone who was at that show is dead.
Too young.
They're all dead. Yep. Just didn't live.
They weren't born yet.
What about the last Rush show in Cleveland? Where was that?
It was probably the Coliseum, right? Is that what you call it now? What do you call it now?
Why are they booing?
Sorry?
Are you guys booing?
Q? What do you call it? The Q? I don't know. These names change.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm old. I don't remember that shit.
Some insurance company bought it. That's right. So Cleveland has been a big city.
Huge city. We played a lot of different gigs here. Our very first tour with Neil, we played, I think it was the second or third show with opening for Uriah Heep.
Oh my God.
Here. And then we played again at the Agora. That was an amazing show. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Yeah, so we've had a lot of great memories here. We recorded a live album here, of course. That was just a lot of fun to do. So this crowd has been really kind to us, and if it wasn't for the well-documented reaction we got to our first record here, we may never have gotten an American recording deal.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
There was a time when you thought that maybe you were going to lose your American recording contract, which is something that we'll talk about too, because that moves into 2112.
That's right. Exactly right. Yeah, we made a couple of strange records that our record company wasn't pleased with. For some reason, they didn't want us singing about space dogs. Go figure.
So many of the great Beatles songs are about space dogs.
Well, they were. Yeah, no, space dogs wasn't what they were bargaining for when they signed us.
The song wasn't called Hey Bulldog originally. It was called Hey Snow Dog.
Okay.
Little known fact.
All right.
Should we sit?
Let's sit. Let's sit and talk.
You wrote a very unusual and wonderful book. I've read a lot of rock memoirs. I don't know if you did in preparation for writing yours, but yours is different from start to finish. And I want to start our conversation the way you start the book. Let me ask first, how many people here have already read the book? Right. So it hasn't been out very long, so that's not surprising. But I wanted to make sure that most of you don't know this. Here's the first line of the book. You probably know me as Geddy Lee, but my birth name was Gershon Eliezer Weinrib, after my maternal grandfather who was murdered in the Holocaust. As soon as I read that, I knew that this was going to be a very different kind of rock memoir. Why start that way?
God, so many reasons. Because when I approached the idea of doing a memoir, autobiography, I wanted to be me. I wanted to introduce my audience and whoever else found some interest to read about my life, where I began, what I began as, and what came before me speaks loudly for the kind of person I grew into being. So I thought, let's get right to the quick, and let's take the edifice of all these different identities I've assumed over the years and strip it right down and start from scratch. And so that's why I started the book like that.
Is there any difference between Geddy Lee and Gershon Weinrib?
There used to be, I would say. You know, when I ran away from my roots after my dad passed away, and I decided on this journey of being a musician, and I was fortunate enough to meet some wonderful players like Alex Lifeson and Neil Peart. And so when I entered that vacuum, I really did try to distance myself from my roots, from Gershon Eliezer Weinrib. Because I wanted to be in the rock business. I wanted to be, I had aspirations in rock music. And I sort of kept all that very quiet. But as I grew up and as I became prouder of my background and closer once again with my family, I realized that those two personalities were merging. And it took a long time, but they finally did merge. And the older I get, the more I want to feel that I'm, regardless of the various monikers I've assumed over the years, I am that singular person underneath.
I don't know whether this went into your thought process at the time, but back before Google, it was kind of a mystery who was Jewish and who wasn't. Right, especially among performers. I remember hearing that Bruce Springsteen was Jewish, but I think that things might have been a lot different if we as Jews had been aware that Lou Reed was Jewish, Paul Simon, Randy Newman, Carole King. I'm sure I'm leaving people out. That's the sort of thing that I wish we'd been taught in Hebrew school.
Well, it's true. I mean, when I was a kid, there were just a few icons. Sandy Koufax, of course.
Yes.
Hank
Greenberg, yeah.
Al Rosen, I think you guys might know Al Rosen here. But, so being a small part of the world's population, 0.2% of it, we cling to those icons that, lift us up, and we bathe in their reflected glory.
I think I have to ask this, 0.2%. There's a very long, detailed chapter in the book about the Holocaust. I'm not trying to scare people off from buying the book, by the way. There's some jokes, too. Some good jokes. Why was it no, actually, let me rephrase that. What would you like people to know about the Holocaust, especially given the fact that we live in a world now where there are lots of people who will go online and spread the lie that there was no Holocaust?
Well, that's one of the reasons I felt it important to include this chapter, but I was motivated by a lot of things. Number one, what is a memoir supposed to tell you? It's supposed to introduce the real you to an audience. And to understand the real me, the person I evolved into, as we talked about earlier, you have to understand my roots, the environment I was raised in. And for me to explain that, I really wanted to explain what they went through, how they barely survived. And so their story is in my blood, it's in my DNA. And so I thought it's integral for me to restate that And also, I wanted to pay homage to my parents, especially my mom, who, you know, passed away recently, a couple of years ago. So, it's an homage to her. It's an explanation of the kind of person I am and how my value system was created. And it's a restatement of the fact that these eyewitnesses are disappearing. You know, they're not around anymore to tell their own story. So it's up to us to tell their story.
There's a lot in the book about your mom. There's less about your dad, which makes me curious about him. He died when you were 12 years old.
Yeah.
What was he like, and are you like him?
Well, I had him for 12 years, so I knew him as he was the life of the party. He was a very funny man. He loved and lived a joyous life. He was always joking with us. He was even made rude jokes, which, if you know me, kind of similar. But what I didn't know about him till after he died was that he was a musician in the old country. And that shocked the hell out of me, because my mother tried so hard to prevent me from being a musician. And I heard the story from my aunt that he played at weddings, he played the balalaika in the old country, and he wanted to bring it, of course, with him when they emigrated here in 1948 to Canada, but she wouldn't let him. So I would love to have had the opportunity to talk to him, musician to musician, you know, and find out what about music he liked, but he never talked about it. And he never talked about the war. He enjoyed his life. He was always the guy at the party or picnic that you could see his eyes were a little, you know, half closed because he'd had a few too many schnapses. And
which you've never done, of course.
Never. I watch what I drink very slowly as I take yeah, so my impression of him was that he was the life of the party. He had a big personality and a quick temper. You didn't want to get him mad because he would, you know, put you in line. And then he was gone. And so many questions that had to remain unanswered.
Well, it just so happens that I have a balalaika with me, so
let's see if I can figure it out.
Did you ever learn to play one?
No, I didn't. But I bet you Alex could play one, even if he doesn't think he could. He loves any string instrument.
Is it true that the bass is easier because there are only 4 strings and 2 of them you basically ignore the whole time?
Yes, it is true. In fact, it is true.
I'm just going to guess that this has been a topic that you and Alex have explored once or twice over the years.
You know, it's funny because there was one song we wrote, I think it was on Snakes and Arrows, where we switched instruments and wrote the song. And it was really fun, but I was really pissed off how well he was playing the bass. It was quite disturbing to me. I thought, I don't want you to give me that back.
Do you remember any of your dad's jokes?
Yeah, when he used to fart, this is true. When he used to fart, he used to say to us kids, "Did you see it?" If you're like 5 years old, 8 years old, that's funny shit.
I'm a lot older than 5, and it's funny shit to me. So. Did he do pull my finger?
Yes, he did. Every parent has to do that. I've done that to my grandson. I teach my grandson all the good stuff.
Any other jokes that your dad?
That's the only one I recall.
Okay.
Really. It's the only one I recall.
Your parents, if I have this chronology right, they originally met in Auschwitz.
No. They met in the work camps before Auschwitz. Okay. Work camp in Starachowice, Poland. My dad was from a town about 40 minutes east of the town my mother was raised in. And she was incarcerated in a work camp, and then they brought about 100 surviving young, strong men from this little village called Godselin, and that's how they first met. They were both in the same work camp.
And then they were in Auschwitz together, which is where your father started wooing your mother.
Well, no, actually, that started in Sachowitz as well.
Okay.
He was operating a crane and moving lumber and things like that. He was working with these ovens. I think they were melting metal parts or something like that. And he paid a kid to bring her some bread. And my mother received the bread and was kind of freaked out because she was like maybe 13 at that time. And she didn't know who it came from. And then when she found out it was from this guy, she was very intimidated because, my dad was about 5 years older and he was very strong and she thought he was handsome, so she was kind of freaked out, but she didn't think he was Jewish. He said he's much too strong to be Jewish.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
He was too manly, so it's really quite a beautiful story. And eventually, he had met my mom's brother, and my mom's brother had shown him a picture of his family, and when he saw a picture of my mom, he demanded it. And he sort of had a crush on her from her picture. So eventually they started this flirtation in the most unlikely and horrible circumstance. So when they finally got shipped out in 44 to Auschwitz, of course, by that time, they were sort of, really crushing on each other. And when they got to Auschwitz, of course, they're separated because there was a men's camp and a women's camp. And my dad would do things like he would bribe an officer, a guard, to bring my mother's shoes. But the woman guard was too freaked out, afraid she'd get caught, so she did it one shoe at a time. And it was really sweet. My mother received this going, you can imagine the hellhole and the shape they were in by that time. But that was the beginning of it. And then when they got shipped out of that camp, they lost touch with each other, and they didn't know if each other was alive until the war was over.
You and I have talked about this before. My wife's parents were both in Auschwitz and met later. And what ends up happening, the way I've seen it, is either there are families that will not talk about it, or families that will not stop talking about it. You had one parent who did each. Your mom was the one who told you lots of stories. A kid shouldn't necessarily hear those stories. Why did she tell you?
Well, it's a good question. I think partially because I believe that was her childhood. That was her adolescence. So she was excited to share her adolescence with us, as not only a cautionary tale, I think, but also to let us know how fortunate we were to be alive. And, she told us all kinds of stories that in many homes would be considered not a very good thing to do to a young child, because it did give me nightmares. I did have, nightmares about that whole thing. But it was just important for her to tell us, to educate us, because, right up until the day she passed away, she was afraid that it could happen again. And she wanted us to be on guard, be aware.
I think it's a form of love. It's probably not the ideal form of love, but it is love.
Yeah, well, that's all she knew to do. And my dad, on the other hand, never talked about it. But I think he knew that my mom was.
So your parents were sent to different work camps. They were separated. I think your mom had assumed that your dad died, and then they reconnected, which is I mean, itself kind of an incredible story.
Yeah, it's an amazing story because when my mom was liberated, she was liberated in Bergen-Belsen, and that camp was a converted prisoner of war camp. And by then, the German, machine was falling apart, and so they panicked when the Russians were getting close to Auschwitz and just started shipping people into Germany, and they just left them there to basically get disease and starve to death. But my dad, on the other hand, was part of a death march out of Auschwitz and then ended up in Dachau, and eventually got liberated there, and then ran into my mother's brother who also had survived. And so together they would look at the postings, because they used to do these postings, after the survivors were liberated, they would check these postings every day to see who else was registered as being alive. And when my dad found out my mom was alive, most of his family, by the way, had not survived. And he said, well, I'm going there. And my uncle wanted to go with him, but he had to go back. He was living in Munich, and he had to go back and pack and all that stuff. And my father was too impatient, and he hitchhiked across Germany. And he came walking into the camp one day, almost giving my mother a heart attack. And they got married in Bergen-Belsen in the displaced persons camp, right in that camp. So it's a pretty amazing story, and I'm very grateful because I wouldn't be here talking to you if that
not just the fact that you wouldn't be here, but they went to Halifax, right? They left Europe. How did they pick Halifax, Canada as their new home?
Well, it was just a transport station. That's just because they were traveling by ship, and so the ship docked there, and then I believe they took a train across country to Toronto. They came to Toronto because my father had a sister that had left Poland before the war, so that was their contact, and so they went to Toronto so that they could start a new life. And he wanted to be with his sister, and his brother had his one surviving brother. He lost, I think, 4 brothers and 2 sisters in the war. And so he had one sister that survived, one brother that survived, and he lived in Detroit. So he wanted to be in the New World. Yeah, so he had a little bit of family. He wanted to be relatively close to them.
Let's jump ahead to Rush's career. There was a real struggle in the beginning. I think you've said that you felt like maybe Rush was going to get dropped by your record company, which is a thing, record companies used to give bands much more time. Springsteen would have been dropped, Mellencamp, Billy Joel, all these people who didn't succeed on their first couple of records. Now you get 1, maybe 2 chances, and that's it. So you had made the album Caress of Steel, which didn't do very well. By the way, did you ever consider that maybe the title was the problem?
I love the title, even though when they fucked up the cover, it looked like it should have been called Caress of Bronze. I said, wait, steel doesn't look that color, fuck. But, that album was an experiment in a way, because first of all, just a quick recap, it took us years of writing the songs in the bars to accumulate the songs for the first album, which we did in a number of nights after playing, the bars from like 8 till 1 in the morning. And then the first version of that first album, of course, sounded really crappy, and then we were introduced to a gentleman named Terry Brown who saved it. And we recorded some new songs for that. And then our second record, Fly By Night, we were able to record, we had a whole 10 days to record. But by the time we got to Caress of Steel, we were drunk with our luxurious 3 weeks we had to record it.
Also drunk.
Well, we weren't drunk, we were very high. We had...
I apologize for getting that detail wrong.
Yeah, we would never play drum. But smoke some hash oil, yeah, we smoked an inordinate amount of hash oil, I'm afraid. So much so that when we listened back, we thought, wow, there's a lot of reverb on this record. It sounds really great. And about 3 weeks after we finished, it was like, there's no reverb on this record. Fuck, what was that all about? So, yeah, we needed to experiment. We were, I remember I had a friend that came to the session, and his name was Mendelssohn Joe. He was he passed away last year. He was a great blues guitarist, a folk guitarist, and he was an artist, a folk artist. And he came to visit us during the Caress of Steel sessions, and he was watching us, you know, pass a joint around and talk about the song and sit in the control room. And after he was there for a couple hours, he left and said goodbye to me. He said, you know, I have to say something. You guys really know how to waste time. I said, oh, are we wasting time? I thought we were being creative. Anyway, so the record was our first experiment with doing a sidelong concept. And of course, some of it, you know, was quite good, and other parts of it were a little unusual. But it was part of our growing. You know, we had signed a deal to make 2 records a year for 5 years, you know. And so that's a lot of writing and going in the studio. So when it came out, of course, some fans loved it, some fans didn't get it, but our record company and management were really scratching their heads going, what is the Fountain of Lamnef?
No one knows.
What is the Fountain of Lamnef?
People still wonder,
Anyway, so part of that tour we called the Going Down the Tubes tour. Because our gigs went from, you know, we were on a sort of ascending trajectory, and suddenly we were not so ascending. We were kind of working our way down the ladder of success. We were opening a lot of shows with Ted Nugent, who was struggling at that time too. But these were kind of small venues and playing all over the place, driving and driving and driving and playing and driving. And we really were getting a lot of pressure to commercialize. And so, of course, we took the advice of our management and record company quite seriously and went back in and did another concept album. Because we said, fuck you, if we're going to go down, we're going to go down our way.
And you and I talked about this. The great moral of 2112 is, the lesson is, instead of selling out or watering it down, trying to write a hit, you went deeper into what it was you were doing, right? It got more extreme. And it's a great lesson for artists. That's what started to make the band successful. When you weren't only ignoring you guys need to write a hit, you were defying you guys need to write a hit.
Yeah, well, I mean, we figured we had nothing to lose by being ourselves as much as we could be ourselves. And so we wrote these songs in hotel rooms and in the studio itself, putting bits and pieces together. And we really believed in it. Now, of course, we didn't think anyone would like it, but it turns out our songwriting had improved. We had streamlined our style a little bit, even though it was a sidelong work. It had a lot of passion, and I think maybe our circumstances made that happen. And plus, we had been playing on the road now for a couple of years nonstop, 3 years pretty much nonstop, and our chops were getting better and better and better. So we were a better version of that band that attempted a concept on Caress of Steel, and we were unknowingly more accomplished. And it showed in the passion and the response to the record.
One of the things that isn't in the book, which is in a lot of rock memoirs, is here's how we wrote our biggest hits. Right? Here's how we wrote Closer to the Heart. And here's why it was a breakthrough, and everything was roses after that. Did you read rock memoirs in preparation for this to get a better idea of what you did and didn't want to do?
No, I read no rock memoirs. I made my co-writing partner, Daniel Risher, read every fucking memoir.
It's always the ghostwriter.
Yeah, I said, look, you read the memoirs, so you have a concept of the context that my stories will follow. But I just want to write what I feel, what I think, and that's what I did. And I didn't know any other way to start but from the beginning, as I said earlier. And so I just started to cobble down as many memories as I could. I would send them to Daniel, and he would take the word fuck out quite often. So I started using effing a little more regularly to soften that. He would correct some of the grammar, and he would push me, which is pretty much what an editor does, I assume. He would come back and say, well, you say that you were in this session and it was great. Well, don't say great. What was so great about it? So he forced me to dig deep and to come up with more descriptions, and that really opened my mind up. And what I'm really grateful to Daniel for was that he really didn't change my voice. You know, he let me write and let me speak the way I speak, and he just tried to shape it a bit. And of course, it was during the pandemic, and we started early in the first lockdown, and you know, I was recovering. I was quite sad when I started writing that book because my friend and bandmate had passed away. So I was in naturally a reflective mood. And there was a combination of things at work. Neil had gone, and he had just suffered through 3.5 years of a fight, literally a fight for his life. And my mom was falling deeper and deeper into a state of dementia, suffering from the ravages of that horrible disease. So not a lot to be happy about in that particular lockdown, and I found I needed something to help me break through that. You know, how do I deal with this loss and the inevitable loss of my mom? So looking backwards seemed important. Looking for clues, and you know, I was seeing a therapist at the time and realizing that when I had lost my dad all those years ago, much of my sorrow was kind of compartmentalized. You know, it was kind of put in a box, and I spent, you know, almost a year doing my duty as the surviving eldest male child, you know, saying the mourner's Kaddish. For those that don't know, I was, you know, my family was a very religious family. You know, my dad wasn't very religious, but he kept that to himself. But I knew because I discovered him eating bacon and eggs one morning in a cafeteria, which was a wonderful revelation for me. But anyway,
by the way, sorry to interrupt. If you were going to sit down and design a religion that no one would want to join, one of the first things would be you can't eat bacon. That's right. I'm out.
Anyway, so it was good for me to go back. Writing this book was very cathartic for me because I was able to go back and put myself back as a 12-year-old boy. And I realized that, you know, my household, when my mom lost my dad, you can't even imagine the pain to her, because that was her, you know, sort of savior at the end of the war. And her great romance, you know, was her great love. And so she was inconsolable, you know, pretty much for the rest of her life. Even though she did remarry, she was inconsolable. So my household became really a sad place. And But kids don't get attended to, and the sorrow that the kids are feeling is left unattended. And so that was me. And so when you lose someone, very sadly, as I'm sure many of you know, one loss becomes a part of the river of all your losses, you know. And so I think it's very important to go back in time and examine those things in case you can learn something. And I learned that no one ever asked me how I felt, how I was doing. You know, it was all about my mom's loss, and rightfully so. But kids are people too. And they needed some consoling, and we didn't get that. So anyway, it was a long, slow journey out of that thing, but in many respects, it made me a musician, because I had spent a year away from music. In our household, I wasn't allowed to have music. I even had a bar mitzvah that year, and I couldn't have a band, couldn't have a party. You know, it was part of the mourning process. I mean, Jews really know how to grieve. I'll tell you, they're really good. Chinese food and grieving, we're really good at.
Tax preparation.
That's tax preparation. But so I was determined to catch up when I left that period, and I threw myself into music. I bought records, I listened to music all the time, and I was finally, the guy who lived next door to me was selling a guitar, and I begged my mom to give me the money to buy it, and she said yes, surprisingly. And I spent all my time learning how to play For Your Love by the Yardbirds, Oh Pretty Woman, and the instrument was manageable. You know, I discovered something about myself. I can do this thing. I can play. I can listen to a song and then figure it out, even though I wasn't being properly schooled. So that was it. I had to be a musician, and that started me down this path.
There was something else during the pandemic which I think was also kept quiet. 2 months after Neil died, Alex was hospitalized with COVID.
Yeah.
And said goodbye to his wife, because family members were not allowed into hospitals. Would it be accurate to say that he almost died?
Well, it's really hard to know because no one was allowed in. He was really sick, and at that time it was so early in that disease that nobody really knew. We were told he had pneumonia, but this was a kind of pneumonia that wasn't normal, because he was on a breathing device, and we were scared that we were going to lose him, but he got through it, thankfully. And so yes, he lived to eat another day.
The first draft that you turned in of this book was 1,200 pages.
Yes, it was.
You are not a man who understands brevity.
I have been accused of that.
What was it that was cut?
Oh, I talked about a lot of relationships I had outside of Rush. I talked about all the trips I've done, all my other hobbies, and there were some Rush stories that were cut, but mostly what, was viewed as extraneous activities.
Any stories that came back to mind that you had to cut that you want to tell?
Boy, on the spur of the moment, I can't think of any.
That's fair.
I'm sure there are some. In fact, in the tour book that we gave you guys when you came in, there are 3 stories that were cut from the book, and a few interesting things. One of them in particular is about my failed attempts at keeping a tour diary. And in fact, there's pictures in that book of my failed diary. Once in 1975, I decided I was going to keep a diary, and it's the weirdest fucking diary. I had all these columns. You'd think I was an accountant or something. I had all these columns, and there was the, gig, city, fan response, attendance. Oh, who did we open for? It was so fucking anal. And so after about 3 or 4 weeks, I just stopped. It's like, what's the point of this? And of course, hitting the streets and the revelry of this mad, drunk place. And of course, we were at that point experimenting with Quaaludes. And so, taking a Quaalude and going out into Mardi Gras is not an advised thing. You talk about cautionary tales. That's a cautionary tale. Don't do that. Kids, don't do that.
There are no kids here.
There was an 8-year-old last night.
Really?
I felt really bad for all the swearing.
But not that bad, apparently.
Not that bad. Anyway, so yeah, that was my 2 of the 3 failed attempts. But there are other stories, but I thought they did a really good job of cutting it down. And when I finished the book and I handed it to the editor, our editor, and he was kind of afraid to touch it because he didn't want to feel the wrath of Rush fans. So he made Daniel do it. And, and Daniel had to do the heavy lifting, honestly. And really, they wanted my effing life, but really they wanted my effing life in Rush. So that's the majority of the book, of course.
Geddy, remember your bladder, man. I think it's time to wrap up.
Okay, I have one more question for you, and then we're going to do a lightning round.
Okay.
Let's talk about Neil. When I was in the audience at the New York show, and there were pictures on the screen, every time there was a picture of Neil, people clapped. Neil did not want his illness to be spoken about.
Right.
You effectively covered for him for a number of years. What struck me is that by keeping this a secret, Neil missed the opportunity for Rush fans to show how much they loved him. What does it say about Neil's personality that he wanted to keep this private?
I think, he was a very stoic person. He used to say constantly through his illness, mustn't grumble. And he didn't want sympathy, he didn't want pity. When Alex and I would go see him, sometimes together, sometimes individually, I always preferred to go with Al because the 3 of us became this unbreakable, comedic, absurd little tribe. And we always could make him laugh more readily. But I would start to talk to him. I would say, so how are the treatments going? And he would just shut it down. He didn't want to go there. He didn't want to waste his time talking about his disease with his 2 pals that weren't there all the time. He wanted to have fun. He wanted to, tell, tour stories and just shoot the shit with us, which is completely understandable. So it was very much his demeanor. In keeping with his demeanor, he didn't want people making a fuss. That was Neil. And so we didn't, and we stuck to it, as difficult as it was, because it meant we had to lie, and some people started to hear, some of our friends started to hear that maybe Neil wasn't well, they would ask you, and you would just change the subject, or we got very good at deception, but that's what you do for a friend.
Let's do the lightning round, and then would you do a little reading from the book?
Yes, I'd love to. Okay.
You can join any band in any specific year. What band are you joining, and in what year?
I'm joining Yes. I'm joining Yes in 1975,
75, 76 is the triple album Yes Songs?
Yeah, just like after the Yes album, right around that period, Heart of the Sunrise, all those great.
It figures you would pick a triple album to join. Who knows you better, Alex or your wife?
My wife. I'm such a liar.
By the way, apropos of nothing, this is being recorded, and I'm sure Geddy's wife will watch it. Who's seen you naked more time, Alex or your wife?
Alex.
For a bass solo, how long is too long?
You have to ask them, but in my humble opinion, I think people have very short tolerance for bass solos. And in my history, I never did, most of my bass solos are quite short, and I think it's better to have a 30-second burst than a 3-minute yawn fest. So that's my choice of bass pyrotechnics, I think.
Do you have a favorite name of a funny, obscure Canadian town?
Flin Flon, Manitoba.
What goes on in Flin Flon, Manitoba?
Don't have a clue. I think it's a lot of running between houses to houses so they don't freeze their nuts off.
I think we should all get in a car and go to Flin Flon right now. How often do you listen to Rush?
Not very often, but it's a lightning round, so I can't really get into the story I would tell about that. But I did, for the writing of this record, I'll be brief. Inspired by Neil, who listened to, in his last days, Neil listened to every Rush record when he was on his way to his Bubba Cave. And he was at a point where he couldn't drive anymore. And so his good friend Juan was also a Rush fan, and he would drive him to his cave every day. And his cave was his happy place. And so he listened to all his records, and it was very important for him in the last conversation I ever had with him, for him to tell me how proud he was of so in homage of that, when I wrote this book, I sat down and did the same thing. I listened to every Rush record, and I did my own critique. And of course, it was too long to keep in the book. No surprise there. But it really, I had a lot of really interesting observations of some of the songs. I loved some of them that I didn't think I would love, and I cringed where I didn't think I would cringe. But maybe in the paperback I'll include that as a bonus section.
2 more quick questions. First one, best Rush album and the worst Rush album?
It's very subjective, of course, but I would say Clockwork Angels is our best album. And I'm sad to say, probably Aggressive Steel. For reasons I've alluded to earlier.
Last question. Do you have any hash oil?
Not on me. No, I gave that stuff up. I traded that stuff in for a red liquid that I stash.
What are you going to read tonight?
I don't know. Let's see when I get up. I think, would you guys like to hear me read about the day Neil Peart walked into my life? Thank you. I love you. Midsummer, 1974. The day a certain someone walked into my life. Just at the moment of John Rutsey's departure, we were booked at a big gig in the States to support Uriah Heep at the Pittsburgh Civic Auditorium in August. But wait, like that great line from one of Rush's all-time top tour bus movies, High Anxiety, "Hey Norton, missing something?" Yeah, we didn't have a drummer. John had left the band earlier in July, and here we were talking about starting an American tour on August 14th. We had work to do. We canceled all our pending gigs, drummers were contacted to audition, and we moved into a rehearsal hall in Pickering, Ontario, in Toronto's East End. I believe the historic date was July 28th. Neither Alex nor I had ever been to an audition before, let alone held one of our own, so it was awkward as hell. I remember nothing, I'm ashamed to say, of the first candidate, but I know the next guy was a chap named Jerry Fielding, who was a good steady player we knew and liked, and had brought on board earlier that year when John was sick. After Jerry left, a Ford Pinto pulls up. Pulled up to the loading dock, and out pops this lanky, goofy-looking guy with short hair, no shirt, and his drums in garbage bags. It was a Rogers drum kit, I believe, with twin 18-inch bass drums, the smallest kick drums I'd ever seen. And when he sat on the throne behind them, he looked like an effing giant. I remember him carefully positioning them, and then the rest of the kit, and then he started to play triplets, with those tiny, teensy bass drums sounded like machine gun fire, like They were eye-popping triplets. A grin spread across one of my ears to the other, and we ran through some songs while that grin never left my face. Man, he was so good, so powerful. I suggested we jam on a piece of music that Alex and I had recently written, one in 7/8, that John, the straight-ahead drummer that he was, had no interest in. And the new guy nailed it. I mean, nailed it. His name, of course, was Neil Elwood Peart. And that piece of music would eventually become the song Anthem. I didn't need to hear anyone else. After his audition, we laid down on the floor and gabbed away about a variety of things. Lord of the Rings, Monty Python's Flying Circus, stageware, which of course we were so good at, and more. Excited to find we had so much in common. Alex, however, was quiet. He was upset with me. He sat there looking at me. He was giving me side-eye. Because we'd agreed beforehand not to select anyone before hearing all of them play. And after Neil left, I had to apologize to him. But it was a kind of a role reversal for us, because Alex is usually the more emotional one, the one who wears his big Serbian heart on his sleeve, while I'm generally quieter, the methodical decision maker. But I couldn't contain myself, man. Here was the drummer of our dreams. So just before he left, I overheard Neil talking with Ian Grandy, our first ever roadie. He was having a smoke by the mixing console in the hallway, and I recall Ian being mightily impressed. He asked Neil, "Why do you want to join our band?" To which Neil replied, "I really like the raw materials." For me, that comment revealed not so much a respect for our musicianship, but really his own ambitions. I could have taken offense, but I liked that he was thinking big, not just talking about taking a gig, but being a part of something that could be molded out of that raw material. So anyway, the next drummer arrives, quietly sets up his drums. He'd made out charts to all the songs on the album, and he plays along correctly, and I'm sorry to say, tamely. Following Neil, that poor guy didn't stand a chance. And even Alex is looking at me, winking. We both knew we had our man, so we called Neil that night, and he came in the next day to officially join the band. It was my 21st birthday. What an effing birthday present. We went into rehearsals straight away, and also reveled in what was like walking through door number 1 on The Price is Right. Mercury Records had signed us to a 5-year deal, with Rush expected to deliver 2 albums a year over that term. And with that contract came our first ever advance. So we raced down to Longamoquade Music Store to stock up on gear for our tour. I'd been eyeing a Jet-Blow Rickenbacker 4001. The closest I could get to the one played by my hero of the moment, yes, is Chris Squire. Famously, his was a white 1964 4001S, but you guys knew that already because you read my other book, right? I think Alex bought a 74 Les Paul Deluxe, while Neil got himself a stunning silver Slingerland kit with some big-ass 22-inch bass drums. Not bad after being in a band for a week. It was a dream come true for all of us. But let's pause for a quick reality check. That's right, I said 2 albums a year. And that advance I mentioned is short for advance on royalties. We're spending their money when in fact it was our own. Imagine what those first few weeks must have been like for Neil. Several years earlier, he'd left the comforts of home on expectation, moved to the UK in search of success. After a string of disappointments, he ended up managing a souvenir shop on Carnaby Street. Then he returned to St. Catharines, resigned to playing weekend bar gigs, his days spent selling farm equipment beside his dad, Glenn Peart, the owner of the store. Suddenly, a white Corvette pulls up with life-changing intent. A couple of guys get out, one of them a burly, bearded dude with a record in his hand, who introduces himself as Vic Wilson, co-manager of Rush. He tells Neil he's heard terrific things about him and that the band has a worldwide record deal on the table with a tour of the US ready to go, but no drummer. Neil is understandably doubtful. He says he has to take it all in before agreeing to audition. Thankfully us, and the world of air drummers, he put his hesitations aside and agreed to come out and play. And only weeks later, having taken his pick of any drum kit he wants, he's fully armed and dangerous, warming up for Uriah Heep and Manfred Mann's Earth Band at the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh, USA. Talk about a whirlwind. Thank you. I would like to thank my host for the evening, Rob Tannenbaum. We're going to take a very short break, and then we'll be back for more fun and games and answer some of your questions. And we're going to show you a little video of this other project I've been working on. So I hope you enjoy it. We'll see you soon.